All right, hello and welcome to your first lecture. This is going to be on research methods in psychology. Before I start this lecture, I wanted to give just a couple tips that I think will help, not just with watching this lecture, but also in watching all of our future lectures. So the first thing is that some students find it very helpful to use the closed caption feature in YouTube. So when you click on the closed captions, you're going to be able to see the basically the text or the transcript of the lecture, and this can be very helpful for people that can sometimes have difficulty understanding me. They can read the words. YouTube automatically transcribes that, so there can occasionally be some accuracy issues with the captioning, but that can be an effective tool. That gives you two modalities, so you can both listen and read. And I think it's also a really good way to stay engaged with the lecture is to both listen and read. You don't have to, of course, it's just an option that I wanted to present. The other thing that you can do in YouTube is that you can go into the settings, which is just that gear icon, and you can adjust the playback speed. So of course it's set by default at normal, but if you find for your personal taste that I talk a little bit too fast, you can slow me down. So you can play the YouTube at a 0.75 speed, and that'll slow me down. If on the other hand you're like, gosh, I wish I could speed this guy up, you can actually do that. So just go into the settings and you can do a playback at 1.5 times speed. I actually find that to be a really great life hack. I try to consume a lot of information and a lot of content. I do a lot of that through YouTube. And so sometimes I just like to listen to stuff at 1.5 times speed, and that way I can get in more content in less time. So if you haven't discovered that yet, hopefully that's a good life hack for you. I think the third tip is these are, for the most part, full length lectures. This particular lecture on research methods isn't, it's a little bit shorter, but some of my lectures will go for about an hour. So that can be a long time to watch a video. It's somehow different, when you're in class. It can be a little bit more engaging. There can be a give and take with the class and with the professor. It's just a little bit more difficult to accomplish that in a recorded lecture. So we know that after about 15 to 20 minutes, our attention span starts to wane. It's very cognitively difficult to pay attention for extended periods of time. So as you're watching these lectures, take a look, see how long the lecture is, and maybe just plan in a couple breaks. After 15 or 20 minutes, you can set a timer, or you can just kind of notice your body and how you're feeling. Pause the lecture, get up, walk around, take a bathroom break, get something to eat, just stretch out, whatever it is. Give yourself 5 minutes to just take a break and come back feeling a little bit more refreshed. I'm quite sure it's something that you wish you could do in your normal face-to-face classes and lectures. But all these things are really, in some ways, the benefit of doing an online class. And so when you're watching these e-lectures, use the captioning, adjust the playback speed, hit pause when you need to, and take a break. So, all right. With all that being said, let's get into the lecture. So after hearing this lecture, what I hope you'll be able to do is describe the difference between correlational and experimental designs. These are the two main research methodologies that we use in psychology. There's other ones, but these are the two big ones. Understand how to interpret correlations, understand how experiments help us infer causality, and that's really the main reason why we would use an experiment, is to be able to make cause and effect statements, be able to explain what a longitudinal study is, and then just more generally describe strengths and weaknesses of different research designs, and I will kind of talk about pros and cons, benefits and limitations. I have kind of written this up in your online module, but the whole reason why we have this lecture on research methods is because psychology is a research science. Yes, we have theories, and yes, we have our intuitions about the way that people are, but to really have firm conclusions and to have firm knowledge about people, about behaviors, about the way people think, about psychological disorders, about personality, anything that you can think of that is related to psychology, we need to study people. So we need to do research, and this is how we establish our basis of knowledge. So research methods are very important to psychology as a research science. So in this lecture, I'm going to cover experimental research designs as well as correlational designs, very briefly talk about surveys, quasi-experiments, longitudinal designs, trade-offs, and then go over methodology as well. We are kind of going to do an activity throughout, which is to kind of talk about an example. I wouldn't say that we'll build a study, but I'll use an example throughout. And in fact, we'll start off with it right here. So let's just say we've got this applied research question. This is psychology applied to the educational domain. And we want to know whether highlighting improves retention of information. Possibly in your high school classes, you used a highlighter in your college classes. When you buy the textbook, you're thinking to yourself, well, I spent a lot of money on this textbook. Do I really want to mark it up with a highlighter? If you read online, sometimes you have a PDF. You're thinking, hey, should I use that highlighting feature? So we would want to answer this question: Is it worth it? Do I remember things better? Do I have improved retention of information if I use a highlighter or not? So a research psychologist or educational psychologist or a cognitive psychologist might be interested in actually studying this question. So how do we go about doing that? Well, one way that we can do that is to design an experiment. And our experiment would need to have certain features. The first thing that experiment would need is we would want to randomly draw names and randomly assign people to two different conditions. In the first condition, we would assign students to highlight let's just say a textbook chapter. In the other half, we would randomly assign them to not highlight. So random assignment is a kind of a main feature of an experiment. And the reason that we're going to randomly assign people to highlight or not is we're going to try to even out or spread out any pre-existing differences between people. It could be the case that if we just created these two different experimental conditions, one in which we wanted people to highlight and then measure how much they were able to remember or retain afterwards, another group of people, we say just read it without highlighting, and then we're going to measure how much they remember or retain afterwards. If we just say, hey, which of these two conditions do you want to sign up for? It could be the case that people that are used to using the highlighter anyway would choose highlighting, and people that don't prefer to use a highlighter would choose that condition. Well, in that case, it's not just the highlighting that is different between those two groups. It could be other pre-existing differences that are related to using a highlighter. Maybe the students that naturally use a highlighter are better students. Maybe the people that naturally use a highlighter have more experience using a highlighter, so they're used to using it. So there's several different important factors that could end up being what is known as a confound or an alternative explanation. So what we want to do is we want to make it random. We want to make it random who is assigned to read the passage of text with the highlighter and who is not. And by doing this, we even out any of those pre-existing differences. Okay, that could be academic aptitude. That could be experience with a highlighter, and so on. All right, so that's one way we could go about it. Now there's another way that we could study this question. We wouldn't necessarily have to create these two experimental conditions and randomly assign. We could do this in a more naturalistic way. For instance, if I've got a class of students, I could, if I wanted to, is at our first examination, I could ask you at the time of the examination, how much did you study, or how much did you highlight the readings as you were studying for the exam? And we could say, you could ask that in a number of ways. Just to say, do you highlight it all, yes or no? We could also ask about the extent of highlighting. Is, hey, when you use that text, to what extent did you highlight the different chapters? Some of the chapters, all the chapters, or I do it all the time, I do it very little. It doesn't really matter. That would be one of the questions that whoever is designing the study would need to figure out, how they want to ask that question. But the point is, you could try to establish a relationship between the extent that people say that they highlight or not, and then look at their exam scores. You could say, well, it seems to be that there's a relationship between people that highlight, they get the high exam scores, and people that say that they don't, they get lower exam scores. It must be the case that highlighting has something to do with better memory or retention, and that's the way that they're able to do better on the exam. Now, I would say in an online class, if you've got highlighted material, maybe it's not better memory as much as just being able to find it. So you'd have to tease those things out, and you have to have a more controlled way of doing it. But the idea here is simply that a correlational study doesn't try to assign people to one condition or another. It just kind of naturally asks people to report on their behavior. So this is just the example of these two major methods in psychology: an experiment and a correlational design. In an experimental design, at least one variable is manipulated, and at least one variable is measured. So the manipulated variable is named the independent variable. And in our example, that would be random assignment to a highlighter condition or not. So the manipulated variable is whether or not they used a highlighter. The measured variable is retention of the material. That could be an exam, that could be a memory test, but some way to measure the effect of the manipulated variable. Again, a key feature is that there's random assignment to conditions, and an experiment therefore allows for cause and effect conditions. The key assumption is that by randomly assigning people to conditions, we kind of balance out any pre-existing differences between people. So the only thing that differs between the experimental conditions is, in our example, whether or not they use the highlighter, and therefore it is the highlighter and the highlighter only that can be attributable to differences on our measured outcome variable. Now, in a correlational design, all variables are measured. So we're just, one example is just to have a survey where we ask people, how much do you highlight, and how did you do on the last exam? There's no random assignment. We're not trying to control what people do. We're just looking more or less at their natural behavior. Now, because of this, correlational designs don't allow for cause and effect conclusions. The reason is there could be any number of confounding variables that are the true explanation for why people, in our example, would do better on an exam. Perhaps it's not the highlighting as much as other important differences between people that highlight versus not. Maybe people that highlight are the ones that spend more time studying. So it's not really that it's the highlighter and only the highlighter, but it's these other factors like just spending more time, being more academically motivated. Okay. All right. So just some more terminology. So when it comes to experiments, I kind of talked through these, but just so we have them. Two key terms are independent variables and dependent variables. The independent variable is the variable that the experimenter manipulates, so using a highlighter versus not. But some other examples might be giving people different doses of caffeine, like no caffeine, 0 milligrams versus 200 milligrams, and then measuring things like how alert they are, how much attention people are paying. Even things like test performance would be things that we could measure afterwards. Okay, so the dependent variable is just looking at the effect of the experimental procedure. That's the outcome of the manipulated variable. Okay, so we're going to manipulate dose of caffeine as the independent variable, and then as our dependent variable, we're going to get a measure of people's alertness. Now that could be a self-report measure, right, to say like, how alert do you feel right now on a scale of 1 to 10? Okay, but the dependent variable is the effect or the outcome of the independent variable. Some other key terms for experiments are that we have an experimental group or condition as well as a control group or condition. The experimental group or condition is the group that receives the treatment, the intervention, or the manipulation. All these terms are used pretty much interchangeably. So in our very simple example, the experimental group would be the group that gets the highlighter to use. The control condition would be a group that is treated like the experimental group in all respects, except for that key treatment or manipulation of interest. Okay, so in our very simple example, the control group of participants, they're going to read the same material, they're going to be given the same amount of time to read the material, they're going to be, say, tested in the same setting. They're treated in all respects just like the experimental group. They just don't receive the same treatment. Okay, I've already touched on the importance of random assignment for experiments. This is when the experimenter randomly assigns participants to a particular experimental condition randomly. Experimental conditions, another way of referring to this, is the level of the independent variable. So in our very simple example, we just have two levels of an independent variable, either the experimental condition or the control condition. But it could be the case that in a more complicated experiment, there are more than two levels of an independent variable. We could think about a dose of a particular drug as a, for example, let's just say a dose of caffeine, and maybe our experiment has three levels, like no caffeine, a moderate amount of caffeine, or a large dose of caffeine. So three different levels of an independent variable. But what we would do is randomly assign people to those different levels of caffeine consumption. Because again, you'd want to kind of balance out who normally in their everyday life consumes a lot of caffeine, who doesn't. If we're interested in alertness, who's kind of naturally more alert versus not, who got better sleep the night before, who got worse sleep. All of those things, people are going to differ in all of those things, but if we randomly assign them to 0 milligrams of caffeine, 100 milligrams of caffeine, and say 400 milligrams of caffeine, all of those pre-existing differences will be there, but they will hopefully balance out across those three different conditions. And the reason is we want to try to rule out confounds. Confounds are anything that could undermine an experimenter's ability to draw causal conclusions. So if we don't randomly assign and we let people just freely sign up for different conditions and say, oh, I want to be in the 400 milligrams of caffeine condition, I want to get 2 cups of coffee versus I don't, there could be pre-existing differences between those people that have to do with how much sleep they tend to get, how alert they usually are. And so it might not be the caffeine, but it could be these other pre-existing differences that are responsible for whatever we see on our outcome of interest. So that's the importance of random assignment. So we can think about it in the context of our um, highlighting study. Our independent variable is whether or not people would be assigned to read with a highlighter or not. Dependent variable, if we're interested in memory or retention, we could say give a quiz or an exam on key facts or key information in that passage of text. Why would it be important to randomly assign? Well, the main reason is because we would want to make sure that that participants don't self-select into groups. Because by self-selecting, I'll choose highlighter versus not, those groups could be fundamentally different. Some people might be the people that are better at highlighting anyway, and are used to it and are skilled at it, they might gravitate towards that highlighter condition, in which case we see that they have really good memory and really good retention, but it just had to do with they were skilled at using a highlighter anyway. And what about possible confounds if participants were not randomly assigned? Well, just the ones that I mentioned. It could be all kinds of things. Differences in intelligence, difference in familiarity with highlighting, differences in academic aptitude, all kinds of things. So there's all kinds of confounds if we don't randomly assign. Now there's a couple other considerations with experiments, and one is the use of placebos. So, and this is particularly relevant when psychologists and doctors for that matter are interested in looking at the effects of different drugs or substances. So this could be alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, etc. So we want to know, how do these drugs or substances affect people's thinking and their behavior? We need to have a placebo. And the reason is because when we give people a pill or a piece of nicotine gum or an alcoholic beverage, we're not just studying the chemical effect of that substance in isolation. You also have people's beliefs and expectations about what that substance is going to do to their body. And so, like when we have an alcoholic beverage, there's some expectation about what that's going to do. It's going to make us more relaxed, maybe less inhibited. So it's not just the actual alcohol, but it's our beliefs about what that alcohol is going to do to us. So, and of course, this is very important if we want to know if we're testing a new drug, maybe a new vaccine, maybe a new therapeutic medicine. We want to know that it is actually the medicine, it is actually the vaccine, it's actually the substance itself, and nothing else. It's not people's expectations. It's not what they choose to do, like their behaviors. It is actually the substance itself. So how are we going to, do this or account for this? Well, researchers use what's called a placebo. A placebo is essentially a fake substance. Okay, a placebo would be a pill that looks exactly like an aspirin. It just doesn't contain aspirin in it. A placebo would be getting a shot in the arm that doesn't contain any vaccine. A placebo would be getting an alcoholic beverage that doesn't have any alcohol in it. Okay, so a placebo is basically a fake substance. It's inert, as in it doesn't have any of the active substance in it. So what can sometimes happen is what is known as a placebo effect. This is when participants' own expectations influence their behavior or perceptions. So the belief that there's going to be some medicine or treatment can create perception that there will be a therapeutic effect, and that people feel as though their condition is being improved. And placebo effects are well documented, not just in psychology, but in medicine. So people that have some underlying health conditions, these can be psychological conditions, but these can also be things that have a physical manifestation. So muscle pain, skin irritation. People go in and they participate in studies. And what a great deal of research shows is that participants that are given a placebo, that is a pill that doesn't have anything in it, or an injection that doesn't have anything in it, actually report some improvement in the underlying medical condition. So fewer symptoms, less pain, lower irritation. So this is known as a placebo effect. Okay? Merely the belief that they received something leads to an improvement. So what we try to do is we try to rule out placebo effects. And we do this with an experimental design that gives participants, one group of participants a placebo, and another group of participants the active drug that has the active ingredient. Okay? And then what you have to do is compare. So if there's a reduction in symptoms in the placebo group, what you're hoping to see is an even bigger reduction of symptoms in the treatment group that actually got the drug. Okay? So if we have an aspirin we're giving, to try to reduce the number of headaches, people that took the placebo might say, I'm feeling less headaches. I'm reporting less than I normally do. What we need to see to establish that the aspirin is effective is that in the treatment group, they need to report fewer headaches than the placebo group. All right. Now, the reason that a placebo is important is because of something called participant demand, that there's expectations, there's beliefs. Participants try to act in a way that they think the experimenter wants them to behave. So when you study the effect of alcohol in a laboratory, oftentimes you'll get participants acting a little silly and acting a little goofy. Some of that could be due to participant demand. It's, hey, we kind of know what's going on here. We're being served alcoholic beverages. We know how to act. Okay, so that's an issue. Another issue is that experimenters have their own expectations. And so when an experimenter knows what is supposed to happen, essentially they know the study hypothesis, and they know who is assigned to the different conditions. They know who gets the placebo, they know who gets the active drug, or they know who gets the highlighter versus they know who doesn't. An experimenter might inadvertently act in a way which influences participants or their own observations of behavior. Okay? So the way to control this, and especially when you see medical trials or pharmaceutical trials, and this is something that is used in psychology as well, but hopefully these terms will, if you aren't familiar with these terms, you will be now, because they're really used in many more applications than just psychological research, and medical research in particular. But researchers want to use a double-blind procedure, and this is that neither the participant nor the experimenter knows what condition the participant is in. Sorry, that says what condition the experimenter is. That neither the participant nor the experimenter knows what condition the participant is in. So that way we can be very confident that whatever we're giving the research participant, whether it's an active drug, whether it's whether it's therapy, we can be clear that it's due to the drug, the intervention, the manipulation, and nothing else. It's not due to participant demands, characteristics, or experimenter expectations. I've embedded a link here that is a video that explains placebo effects in a little bit more detail. So I think that this should help clarify some things if it's not clear. I think it's just interesting to hear about placebo effects. So check that out. All right, so let's move on to correlational research. So just as a reminder, in a correlational study, researchers don't intervene in any way to change behavior. They just try to measure it as it occurs. A predictor variable is the variable that the researcher considers the cause of another. So in an experiment, the predictor variable is an independent variable. But in correlational research, we just don't call it an independent variable because that's terminology for experiments. We call it a predictor variable. Okay. Similarly, in experiment, we had a dependent variable. Now in correlational research, we have an outcome variable. The outcome variable is just the variable that the researcher believes is affected by the predictor. Okay. So independent variable is like predictor variable. Dependent variable is like outcome variable. It's just a difference of terminology to make it clear that we're talking about an experiment versus correlation. Okay. So we might say that, the number of hours that you study is a predictor variable, and the outcome variable would be test performance, is one example. In correlational research, the association between two variables can be summarized statistically using the correlation coefficient, which is abbreviated using this italicized lowercase r, which is named after the person that came up with the correlation coefficient, Carl Pearson, so it's Pearson's R. A correlation provides information about the direction and strength of the association between two variables. So we would want to know to what extent does the number of hours that you study correlate with exam performance. Right? Are those two things positively related, negatively related, or is there no relationship at all? Correlation coefficients are expressed as a single number, and this number can range from negative 1.0 to positive 1.0. A positive 1.0, or 1.00 here, means that two variables are perfectly correlated in a positive direction. So in a particular sample of scores, the highest score on one variable goes with the highest score on the second variable. The second highest score on the other variable goes with the second highest score on the other. The lowest score on one variable goes with the lowest score on the other. So that's a perfectly correlated. Okay? So in that case, the person that studied the most got the highest exam score. The person that studied the least got the lowest exam score. And the person that studied in the middle got the middle exam score. So that would be a perfect positive correlation. A correlation of 0 means that the variables are not correlated at all. So in this particular example, it would mean that studying had nothing to do with exam performance. And negative correlation would be the two variables are correlated in a negative direction. It doesn't really fit in the example of studying, but let's go to the TV watching example that I have here. So what we can see in the way to try to understand a pattern, a relationship between two variables, is to make a scatter plot like we have here. In these scatter plots, each of the blue dots represents a person in your study. Okay? And we can plot there are two observations in our scatter plot. Okay? So here what we have is the amount of TV that people watch and then how aggressive they are. Okay? And so this is something that psychologists have studied quite a bit to see whether there's a relationship between TV watching and childhood aggression. So what you could find is that there is a positive association between the amount of television watched and aggression. And so in particular, this might be the case, and it's been found to be the case, to the extent that children watch violent TV in which there are characters that are acting in a violent manner. We know that children model behavior that they see. So if they see aggressive acts, they might be more likely to behave in the same way at school with siblings, etc. So when we have a positive correlation between the amount of violent TV watched and aggression, it means that the children that are exposed to the most violent TV are the ones that are the most aggressive. The children that watch the least amount of violent TV are the least aggressive. And then, of course, kind of the middle values go with the middle values. Here's our negative correlation. Well, here the finding has been, what about educational programming? Sesame Street, other programs like this in which children are, taught cooperative behavior, they're taught problem solving. Here, what we might actually see is a negative correlation, where children that watch or are exposed to a higher amount of educational programming are actually the least aggressive because they've learned cooperation and problem solving skills, whereas those that don't watch any of the good TV, we'll say, they're the most aggressive because they haven't been able to learn that content or see others model the behavior. So in that case, we've got a negative correlation. High values on one variable go with low values on another. And then, of course, you can have a zero correlation. Now, in everyday life, perfect correlations are rare, okay? And indeed, what you see with this scatter plot is that the points are not directly on the red line. So the red line would, in both cases, would represent a correlation of perfect positive 1, or in this case, perfect negative 1. In perfect correlations, both a 1 and a negative 1 are perfect correlations. Okay, a perfect positive correlation and a perfect negative correlation. But those are rare. So here's a little activity just to see if we're kind of understanding the direction of the correlation as well as the magnitude. Okay, so we've got some relationships here on the left-hand side. We've got time on social media and exam scores. We've got being an animal lover and owning a cat. And then we've got having a sweet tooth and then the number of desserts consumed. So we want to ask, is there a relationship between the two variables? Is that relationship positive or is it negative? And what is the size of that association? Like, how strong of an association do we think that it is? Recall that the closer that you get to 1, either positive 1 or negative 1, the stronger the association, and the closer to 0, the less strong the association. Well, let's take a look at our choices here. The first correlation is 0.75, positive 0.75. So we've got a strong positive correlation. In this case, correlation of negative 0.5. We've got still a pretty strong, kind of a moderate to strong negative correlation. And then a 0.2, we've got a positive correlation, but it's less strong. So what we're going to do is play the matching game, and and you can do this on your own. You can kind of think about which of these relationships should be paired with the correlation coefficient. Let's think about this first one. Time on social media and exam scores. Well, let's think about this. The more time that we spend on social media, do we think that that would be associated with higher or lower exam scores? I tend to believe that the more time you spend on social media means you're probably not studying so much, right? So I wouldn't expect a very high exam score. So in this case, a higher number on time on social media is likely to be paired with a lower exam score. Similarly, if people have a low score on social media, they're like, I spent close to no time on social media this week because I was studying, I would expect them to have a higher number on exam score. So what we have here is we've got high numbers on one variable going with low numbers on the other variable. So that's going to be a negative correlation. I would expect the relationship between those two variables to be a negative correlation. What about between being an animal lover and owning a cat? Being an animal lover and owning a cat. Well, some of you might be animal lovers, but you might not own a cat. Why? Because you own a dog or something else. Right? So in that case, yeah, they might be positively correlated, but it might not be a very strong association because you can be an animal lover and not necessarily own a cat. I would expect that animal lovers, there's a stronger chance that somebody who is an animal lover is going to own a cat versus somebody that's not. People say, like, I hate animals, probably not going to own a cat. But it's far from perfect, right? Because you can be an animal lover. You could say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you like animals? 10. Do you own a cat? Well, a lot might, but other people might own a dog or something else. All right, last one. Process of elimination. Having a sweet tooth in the number of desserts consumed, right? You can say, like, hey, scale of 1 to 10. To what extent do you have a sweet tooth? 10. Well, how many desserts did you eat this week? Okay, you'd expect high numbers, you have high numbers, versus if somebody's like, I don't have a sweet tooth at all, 0, just don't like it. They're probably not eating any dessert, and kind of middle going with middle. So we'd expect a strong association, a strong positive correlation between those two variables. So hopefully that helps to illustrate it, but the idea is that when you're reading a research study, you're reading a study that is published in a psychological journal, researchers might report a correlation. And so by looking at the number, it tells you two things. Okay, the sign, positive or negative, tells you whether there's a positive or negative association. And then the number, okay, can range from 0 all the way to 1. It tells you how strongly those two variables are related. All right, now you may have heard the phrase correlation is not causation, and I want to go over an example of why that is. So let's just say that a researcher conducts a study in which he finds a positive correlation between the number of hours that teens spend on Facebook and their score on a depression inventory. Okay, we kind of have a good sense of how to interpret that correlation coefficient now. We know it's positive, such that the more hours teens spend on Facebook, the higher their score on depression, and the fewer hours they spend on Facebook, the lower their score on depression. And it's pretty strong. Okay, the best we can get is a 1, so 0.7 is strong. So we've perhaps heard the adage that correlation does not equal causation, but why is that the case? All right, well, first things first, it could be the case that the number of hours that a teen spends on Facebook does in fact cause depression. That's the first explanation. And it's just one thing that we'll learn about later in this class is the idea of social comparison. And when you're on Facebook or other social media, seeing everybody out there living their best life, everybody seems to be leading a better life than me, so that's kind of making me depressed. I'm feeling bad about myself because I'm seeing the wonderful life that everybody else is having. So it always is a possibility that when you see that positive correlation, it could be the direction of causality could be that it's Facebook that is causing the depression. But here's why, and maybe you can think of your head what some of the alternative explanations are. One alternative explanation is reverse causation. So just because we see a positive correlation, it just means that high numbers go with high numbers and low numbers go with low numbers. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the number of hours on Facebook is causing the depression. In fact, it could be completely opposite. That people that are depressed, maybe they're spending more time on social media because they're not out spending time with their friends, they're spending time inside, they're not interacting with others. This might sound familiar. And so they're depressed, and it's their depression that is leading them to spend more hours on Facebook. Versus people that are not depressed, they're in a good mood, they're interacting with others outside of social media, they're with their family, they're not on the computer, they're not on their phone. And so it's the depression or lack thereof that is actually causing the amount of hours that people are spending on Facebook or other social media. Okay? So correlation is not causation, because it could be the case that we can't necessarily say what the direction of causality is. And also, here's the other reason, there's other confounding variables that we can't rule out, because we don't have an experiment and we're not randomly assigning to condition, we have confounding variables. So one confounding variable, which is also known as a third variable, could be whether or not people have a strong friendship network. And it could be the case that people that don't have any friends are spending a lot of time on Facebook or social media, and they're also depressed. So the reason that people have high numbers, high scores on both Facebook hours and depression, the true causal factor is really that they don't have any friends. Alternatively, people that have a very strong and robust friendship network that they can reach out to, maybe they're not interacting on Facebook nearly so much because they're actually out doing activities with their friends. Okay, in that case, you'd see low scores on social media usage as well as depression. So correlation is not causation because of the idea of reverse causality as well as the third variable problem. All right. I just want to talk about a couple other specific research methods. And the first of these is surveys. So chances are at this point in your life, you've done a survey before, so you have some idea of what it is. We know that with a survey, we're giving research participants a list of questions or items that they're going to complete, either a paper and pencil version or on the computer or on their mobile device. And there's several different benefits of doing survey research. So these are often used in a correlational design. Experiments, you can do experiments using surveys, especially online. As you know, you can have people do a survey, but you can present them with different information at the front. So anyway, a survey can be used in a variety of ways. There's many benefits. It's a very cost-effective way of collecting a lot of information. They generate a large amount of data. It's very easy to distribute a survey. I mean, I'm sure you've taken all kinds of internet surveys or at least are familiar with them. So it's a very convenient way to get a lot of data. There's limitations as well. One is that people don't necessarily tell the truth. Okay, so people alter their true responses when they know they're being measured. People also answer in socially desirable ways. Okay, so people present themselves either in a positive or socially acceptable way. So especially sensitive questions that might have to do with drug use or sexual partners these are people might respond in a socially desirable way. There's also limits to people's self-knowledge. We're limited by our memories in our ability to remember things. So asking people about their behaviors in the past is a good way to not get accurate information. People just have limitations of what they can remember. So if you're studying psychology or other social behavioral sciences and you go on to take a research methods class, you'll learn all about surveys, but I just wanted to introduce this as a tool. Okay. Another research method is known as a quasi-experimental design. This is very similar to an experiment, except that there's no random assignment. So one thing that researchers try to do is they try to look at variables that you can't ethically randomly assign people to do. So for example, you might want to look at differences between married people and unmarried people. You can't randomly assign people to get married. You have to look at that as kind of a natural experiment. So one thing that a researcher could do is try to find couples that are maybe about to get married, and then people that have just gotten married, and then look at things like their satisfaction with the relationship, or how much in love they feel with their partner, And the question might be is, hey, does getting married matter? Does it do anything to the relationship? And by doing this quasi-experimental design is finding people that are just about to get married and versus people that are newlyweds, and then asking those questions, you kind of do an experiment without randomly assigning people. So that's an example of a quasi-experimental design. The benefits is that we can examine uh, phenomena that it wouldn't be possible to randomly assign people to. So you can kind of look at the benefits, or you can look at the naturally occurring phenomena, kind of study them as they occur. The limitations, of course, is just because we don't have random assignment, we still have the same issue with not completely being able to infer cause and effect. Okay, a longitudinal study is where we track people over time. So this often involves taking repeated observations on the same variables. Sometimes this would be taking a measurement of a variable every day, maybe once a week for several weeks. It can be tracking people over a period of years. So for instance, people that study moods would track people over, say, a month, and every single day, and even actually, several different hours during the day, people might be asked to indicate what their mood is at that particular time. So that longitudinal study is going to be able to track people's mood and mood fluctuation over the period of days, weeks, over that entire month. And you can do that with any number of variables. So people have tracked personality over time to see if personality changes from the time that you're an adolescent to a young adult to an older person. And any number of variables that we think could change due to the passage of time. The benefit is it's very useful for studying specific individuals, for being able to see how a specific person changes over their lifetime, and particularly for like identifying risk factors for the development of disease. Another important benefit is we can start to get a sense of whether things like personality are stable over the lifespan. So that's a kind of a fundamental question, and we'll address that later in the course. Is, do our personalities change as we age, or are we fundamentally the same person in the sense that we basically have the same personality from the time that we're an adolescent to a young adult to an older adult, like even into our 60s? So you can kind of think about that and ponder that. I will, no spoilers, we'll answer that question later on about the development of personality. But the way that you study that is with a longitudinal study. You need essentially the same cohort of people, and you're giving them personality inventories over different decades of their life to see whether there's change. What are some of the limitations? Well, based on some of my descriptions, you might get the sense that these can be really difficult, time-intensive studies to do. You've got all these participants, you've got to track them over long periods of time. They might drop out. The people that were originally doing this study, they might just retire. It's just like, hey, I've been doing this for 30 years, I'm done. So they're time-consuming, they're costly, there's dropout, there's all kinds of logistic difficulties in doing them. So that's an overview of some of the primary research methods in psychology. Really do concentrate on the difference between experiments and correlations, as those are kind of the two big ones, but hopefully being introduced to some of the other techniques, surveys, quasi-experimental designs, longitudinal studies will also give you an appreciation for how psychologists do research and collect data to understand people. So All right, that's it for this first lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.